so my name is Thomas Wu. I'm founder of FableLabs. We're building a platform for episodic and interactive fiction. And Dave wanted me to talk to you guys about narrative, and rather than get into nuts and bolts of how we create narrative, I thought it'd be better to actually focus on how do you create the right environment for great narrative. So before I went into the current gig, my last corporate job was in private equity investing focused on media. I was working for this fund called Elevation Partners. We invested into BioWare and Pandemic, combined them, sold them over to EA. And while we were working on investing, and I'd say everyone in this room is an investor. If not with direct capital, you're investing your time and your resources into projects that you find of value. And so there's so much noise out there. And so we often build data models to make sense of this world. And the issue with data models, it seems very obvious, is that data models are based off historical data. They don't tell you why something happened, and they don't tell you what to do. You have to groom your analytic abilities to figure that out. And I want to start our journey with a quote from one of the most famous investors of all time. You can read that over there. It's by John Doerr. And he is talking about what convinced him to invest into Google. And from this statement, I think what's important is what he's implying. Right? Investors like to use pattern recognition to shortcut their decisions. And he's essentially saying, if you're a female, you don't fit our pattern. If you're married, you don't fit our pattern. If you have kids, you definitely don't fit our pattern. If you're a minority, you don't fit our pattern. And this is important because this is an investor that's had huge, huge hits. And the problem is the platform from which he's speaking from, many people take as gospel. And really, I don't want to take anything from the fact that they've been enormously successful, but the reasons for the success, I would challenge, are not these reasons. So let's take a walk down memory lane and see how we might have made some of the similar mistakes. So 1985, birth of mainstream video games. Right? We can go farther back, but let's say it's 1985. So 15 years later, we've gone through 3 console cycles. We've gone through tens of thousands of titles. So we know our target customer. We know the market size. We know the tie ratios of how many games we sell per console. We know the genres, and we know the growth rates for those genres. It's a mature market. We know everything, right? Then there's this young designer. He has a very personal experience. His house burns down. And he decides, wouldn't it be great to make a game that's more about observing how characters interact and about building? And his company laughed at him. They said, teenage boys are not going to play a virtual dollhouse game. Well, EA bought Maxis, and they luckily had the courage to greenlight this title. And so Sims was released in 2000. And then it went on to sell 200 million copies. So this, for its time, was the best-selling video game franchise. It was so big that even within EA's casual department, they broke this out separately into its own division. And the experts were right about one thing. The target customer wasn't teenage males. It was teenage females, who up until this point had been completely neglected. So all the experts said, okay, we've got to update our models. Now we know. It's young people play video games. Got it. So Facebook in 2007 was opening up its API to developers. And this company called SlashKey came out with a game called Farmtown. And Zynga soon after cloned the game, out-iterated them, and brought Farmville to the masses. And so this perplexed everyone, right? Game developers, I don't know if you guys were around at the time, but they were angry. This is, what is this? This is not even a game, right? People created applications and protests. They created cow-clicking games, right? And the biggest insight of this was that what they found was that the highest performing segment, the segment with the highest lifetime value, was women over 45. And again, all the data, all the experts were like, how did we miss this? All our data is wrong. We never saw this data. So then the industry as a whole, we decided to reskin this thing 11 billion times and shove it down their throats until they didn't play anymore. And then we concluded, oh, they never liked it in the first place. So around 2009, 2010, this company by the name of Watercooler, they are down to they've only got one shot left. And so they take this game out there called Ebony. It's a Chinese game. They clone it, and they put it on a Facebook. They tap into the viral channels and they buy Facebook ads against it. And it took them maybe a year to really get to the point where they could acquire users profitably. But when people first saw the game, they thought, there's no way this will ever work. Because everyone knows Facebook games are all about building. It's about building your virtual space. How could a game about infiltrating other people's virtual spaces and burning them down, how could that be successful? Right? Facebook doesn't have hardcore male game players. They're all female. Everyone knows that. And of course, when this ended up being successful, what do? We cloned this a million times, including Kabam. Water Cooler changed their name to Kabam. They cloned their own title several times in hopes of achieving more success with this. So but I don't want to say that we're the only ones that do it, right? If we let's look at the film industry. The film industry has been around much longer than us. They've been around for over a century. And yet, it's shocking to me that only in the last 5 years we're coming to some of these insights, right? Girls like superhero movies? Of course they do. Or that you don't need 2 white male leads to carry a movie. Or even this year, you don't even necessarily need white people to carry a movie. Right? How are we learning these lessons now? Right? So is there everything fixed? Are there no more opportunities on the table for us? Well, let's just take one specific sector. Let's just look at how do we market to females today, right? That's a simple search, games for girls. You can see the color palettes are very, very differentiated from each other, and then they graduate on to dress-up games here. So they can finally reach their crowning achievement, right? I love this one right here. Is this your life-changing moment? Is this your life-changing moment? Did you get that? Did you get that job? Did you solve geopolitics and bring world peace to the world? No. You got pregnant and you're having a baby. You've reached the highest level, right? And the truth is, there's nothing wrong with any of the things that I just showed you individually. But as a collective, is this as simplistic as an entire gender? Is this what we think of an entire gender? Is this all they like? Females definitely do like some of these titles. But does this mean that this is all they like? I would challenge no. I would say that there's a lot of misconceptions about what females like. So let's look at them. It's pretty common. Everyone thinks women don't like high fantasy. Of course they don't. They don't like trolls, orcs, all that stuff. No. Except half of the social media activity on Game of Thrones last year was by females. All right. Outlier, right? Okay, so they definitely don't like blood and violence. Except half of all horror movie fans are female. Well, they definitely don't like sci-fi. Except 3 of the biggest hits in the last few years feature 50 to 60% female audience. Well, there's no way this is wrong. Females like sex way less than men. Except, how do you explain that? I don't know. Could it be that these oversimplistic generalizations are just wrong? So how can we do better? Because I think doing better is what gets you those opportunities, those breakout hits that you're looking for. So first of all, I would go to first principles. And this is a term popularized by Elon Musk when he was trying to figure out how to fly rockets to the moon. And I think it applies to the media business as well. You need to create a hypothesis to explain why you feel the way you do about something. And if that hypothesis makes no sense, keep diving, right? So previously, if we had this thesis that was older people don't like video games, well, let's dive into that. What is a video game? Video game it's interactive entertainment. Well, older people like passive entertainment. Why wouldn't they like interactive entertainment? Well, because they jump in the hole and they die and they don't like. Oh, you're talking about a very specific title. So you're talking about maybe older people don't like games that are not accessible to them. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but at least that's a starting point of a hypothesis. The second is, if you're waiting for perfect data in your market, it's too late. By the time you have perfect data, the opportunities are gone. So what I like to do is I like to look at adjacent markets. So when I was starting out and fundraising for a company, a lot of people questioned. They're like, well, everyone on mobile gaming, they're playing esports, they're doing Clash of Clans. Like, nah, there's no narrative. People don't like narrative on mobile games. And so this is a slide from our pitch deck last year where I showed, okay, let's look at other forms of media. Let's look at books, television, traditional games. And let's look at the concentration in green there of story-driven content versus non-story-driven content. And in all those other media genres, you're seeing anywhere from 50 to 2/3 the story-driven content. And today in mobile, well, back then in mobile, it was 5%. So I can't predict the future. I don't know where it's going to go, but can I bet that it will go somewhere between 5% and 50%? I feel pretty comfortable about that. I remember there's this, when Zynga was launching this game, Adventure World, I got targeted for one of these surveys I thought was hilarious. It was this survey where basically they asked you, what kind of game do you want us to make you next? And they're basically trying to outsource their game design. And what they came back with was actually a list of things that sounded like Star Wars meets Indiana Jones meets Shrek. And I look at this and I think this is a company that's taken data analytics to an extreme, right? And your consumers are not paying you to ask them questions on what to make. You have to have the product conviction to say, I think this is going to be great. And the data, the metrics are there to validate or disprove your hypothesis. But you can't let marketing run the show. And I think this is I truly admire Pixar for having the courage to make a movie that features a rat that wants to be a master chef. Right? Just think about that. What kind of marketing division would let you do that? What's the SEO on a rat? It ranks up there with like moist. It doesn't. It's not. And yet, that's how you create a breakout hit. You do something different. You can't do the same thing that everyone else does. I think that you need to provide data to your creators. A lot of times when you're working on some high-stakes solutions, you end up with the suits running the show, telling creators everything that they need to do. And I think what it actually needs to be is that the producer is there to provide information to the creative. So highlight the pain point, not the solution. You can come up with potential solutions, but let them make the final call on the solution. Because what I found is that when I tell creatives, I say, your story, here are the drop-off points. When I can show them this kind of concrete data, this conversion from episode 1 to completing it to the next episode, et cetera, they're professional and smart enough and creative enough to come up with solutions that I would never think of. As an industry, we have to avoid doing lazy generalizations. Wonder Woman did well, and congrats to Patty Jenkins for pulling it off, but when she was doing this, people were so nervous for her, because if she failed, it would have huge implications for female directors, for superhero genres that feature female leads. And if you think about it, that's ridiculous. If this were a failure, it's because this was a failure. Because there are millions of variables that go into it. It has nothing to do with Patty Jenkins being a female. So the quote that we started with, they invested alongside a fund called Sequoia, and right there on the left you can see Sequoia's makeup. And this is pretty typical for investment funds. It's typical for our industry as well. It's not enough to look around the room and see diversity. The fund I joined had 6 people at the time creating models and doing the analytics, and all of them were Asian. And there were 6 decision makers. So it was John Riccatello, Roger McNamee, Fred Anderson, Bono, etc. All 6 white males. And so it's not just about getting diversity into your organization. You have to make sure that they are in positions of power. So we're seeing great progress. This fund, for instance, they hired their first senior U.S. female investor in something like 44 years. So they checked off both the minority bucket and the female bucket in one swap there. There's tools out there that can help you avoid some of your biases. I really like how this recruiting platform, actually they have a setting where you can make it so you can't see someone's name, you only see their initials, and you can't see their face. And I love it, because now you can evaluate someone on the basis of what they've done rather than who they are from a superficial level. So when we're creating our stories, what we find is a lot of writers, the writers kind of fall in two broad buckets. There's one who have a very concrete idea of how they want all the characters to look. And then there's some writers that say, I don't particularly care about these characters right here, and just give me whatever you have, art asset wise. And so when we're just making these art assets and we weren't tracking anything, I realized that 80% of our characters were white, and it wasn't that we tried to do it that way. It was just that it became the default. It's like, need another character? Make a white person, right? And as soon as we started putting dashboards on the kind of assets in our system, then we were able to normalize out to something that looked much more like the makeup of our consumers. And I want to emphasize that it wasn't like I sat there and I said, there's a quota system, this needs to hit this. All I had to do was share this data. I just shared the data, and things fixed themselves. So, and at FableLabs, the way we're tackling this problem is that we're throwing out the experts altogether. So I want to leave you with this story. There was a writer, J.K. Rowling. Maybe some of you have heard of her. She was a single mother. She was living on food stamps. She was practically homeless, right? And she never had a hit. She definitely didn't fit any pattern of what a hit maker looked like. And she was turned down by 13 experts. 13 people who worked in publishing, whose job it is to review manuscripts, who've been doing it their whole lives. She was turned down by 13 people. And then, as you know, Harry Potter has gone on to be, it's generated $20 billion of revenue. And Harry Potter's kids have yet to tell their stories, right? So they're not even done yet. So what that tells me is that maybe the experts don't know anything at all. And if there's people like J.K. Rowling out there who got rejected 13 times, there's probably other talented creatives out there who don't have an outlet. So if you have a story that you want to tell, please talk to me. I'd love to hear about it. We get a lot of people who say, what's the story that you want me to tell? And that breaks my heart a little bit, because it's not about the story that I want you to tell. It's about the story that you want to tell. Because that's the story that you're going to write with authenticity and passion, and that's how we're going to create a breakout hit. So thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Well, I personally, I'm going to chuck one quickly, because I think the idea of using the scientific method properly, even in creative content, is amazing. And I constantly try and explain to people that making a game is a hypothesis. But you were talking about asking questions. Do you mean just ask questions, or are you testing those suppositions you're responding to as well?
Oh, I just meant that when we have this assumption, right, about, hey, maybe we shouldn't do X because of Y, that you actually take that statement and you say, well, let's really analyze if that's true or not. And because a lot of times we can't find the answers in the direct data, right? And so I'm trying to highlight different techniques that we can do to basically not get at a perfect solution, but make you feel comfortable enough to say, yeah, that's worth investing in. That narrative, let's go for it.
Yeah, no, I actually totally agree. One of the things I was taught as a marketeer was every time you produce an idea or a brand or whatever, always ask, so what? Because so what? Who cares? Why should anyone care? And actually challenging your own perception, your own questions, is also important. Anyway, Tucker.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk very much. I was wondering about replay value with narrative games. How do you go about encouraging people to dive back in after they've experienced the story once?
Sure. So I'm going to be a little biased on this. So replay generally is going to be far less than 10% even. If you get to 10% replay, that's huge. And so I would not optimize for replay. I would actually optimize for your first play. Now, that doesn't mean that you should create interactive fiction that has no branches. I think that you'll find a lot of people do that sort of narrative, and I understand why, right? Branching is expensive. But your player doesn't need to actually replay it multiple times and see all the different ways it can end up. They just need to know that there was the possibility of X and they got Y. And generally that's enough. So yeah, to answer your question, I think the first replay should be your number one goal. And if you win that, then on the replay, that's just icing on top.
But I wonder if, just to throw in a thought, because you're coming at it from a platform play, maybe the opportunity that you're presenting is actually a little bit more kind of stable, because whereas I would normally argue for replay because of the obvious kind of value in terms of games as a service, effectively the platform, I would argue, is the service, and the access to a range of content is the reason to return. So whilst that individual one-time play might not be ideal if you were doing that game yourself, if you're doing that kind of play as part of a wider platform, I think that's a much more sustainable model. Is that fair?
I mean, maybe what also answers your question is if you just look at what is like let's say a traditional retail game with 80 hours of gameplay, what % of people actually make it to the end? It's a fraction. And I think they found, I don't know the exact stats right now, but I think it's around a quarter of people. So, it's easy to sort of, because you care about your product so much, you want to provide all those optionalities, but the reality is most people aren't going to see it. So I would optimize for that first experience.
And on that note, thank you very much. Hang on, let me get with the mic. So we'll run out of time, so it could be really quick.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if you have studied edu-games for apps in the last year or so, and what your opinion would be on that.
Not in the last year, but I definitely think there's a lot of crossover, because I think that stories are the way that we passed information down from the centuries, right? Like we could tell stories before we could write. And so so imagine back in the old day, you're around a campfire, you're listening to this story, and it's like, don't go over there, there's lions over there, and like that's where the watering hole is. And if you didn't like stories, if you didn't pay attention to that, you got eaten by the lion. So as a species, we've grown to use stories as a form of communication, and that's why we're wired for stories. So I think we learn better with stories. And if you look at early educational apps out there, they're all just single, they're like 2 + 2, they're like doing this and that. And then they try to add game mechanics on top of that to make it more interesting, because inevitably students get bored. So the next layer on top of that, I do think there's an opportunity for narrative to teach. And I mean, taking a step back, I learned so much about how gangs and how police and how politics works by watching The Wire, right? And their objective was not to edutain me. It was to write an authentic story by interviewing people who worked in those kind of departments to write a real story. But in that process, you learn something from it. So I think that the best sort of entertainment, educational apps are going to focus on how you entertain, and then knowledge will come with it.